Welcome to Sputnik, orbiting the world with me, George Galloway.
And me, Gayatri.
Jeremy Corbyn used to be his brother. Now he's Jeremy Corbyn's brother. He's brother Piers Corbyn to me. I've been interviewing him for many years, long before he was famous principally for being a prince of the Republican royal family.
And that's because he's not just a weatherman, he's a climate scientist of the top rank. Moreover, one who challenges what Dr. Johnson called the grimmest dictatorship of them all, the dictatorship of the prevailing orthodoxy.
Most others are ranged against him, but then that was the case with Galileo too. So, facing not the Spanish Inquisition, but the Sputnik Inquisition, I'm glad to welcome Piers Corbyn. Piers, they try to paint you as a renegade, a dissident, a maverick, but in fact, you're just about one of the most highly qualified people in this country to speak on this matter.
Well, of course. I've got a first-class degree in physics. I studied theoretical physics, solid-state physics, and I've got an MSc in astrophysics. So I understand Sun-Earth relations and researching into that. I've written papers on galaxy formation and the mean matter density of the universe.
Well, I'd like to have you back to speak on that latter point about galaxy formation, but not today.
Okay.
The essential cause, or the proximate cause, of your disagreement with the climate change lobby is that you don't believe that insofar as there is global warming, that man and man-made activity is causing it. Summarise that, would you?
Well, it's not even a question of belief, it's a question of fact. If you look at the graph, you can see that the projections of the CO2 theory show there should have been continuous warming now, and they still say that there'll be warming, whereas world temperatures, according to satellites, which are accurate, show a levelling out and now a decline, which is completely contrary to their theory.
That would be a very serious state of affairs, given the entire world has been mobilised around the thesis that we were on a path of ever upward global warming.
Well, of course, but you see, the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is not a scientific body. It's a political body. It's for negotiations between governments. And what in fact happens through this process is the Western countries, Britain, Europe, are being deindustrialised, and their activities are being exported to other countries, and the production of CO2 is just being moved from Britain and Europe to India and so forth. So there's not actually any reduction in CO2 by their measures. There is a reduction in jobs. And the people who make money out of it are the big corporations, the big banks, people like Soros, and so forth, who play games of investing in so-called saving the planet. Actually, they're saving themselves.
And yet most of the support for the prevailing orthodoxy comes from people on the liberal left, doesn't it? You wouldn't get much change in The Guardian on arguing your point of view. In fact, most of the dissidents appear to be people on the right.
They are, but not entirely. I've just been to quite a successful conference in Paris, not the big one on TV, our own alternative conference, and the point was made there by a number of delegates: you don't have to be either left or right to stand for scientific truth. And there was people there from the left and people there from the right, and the point is we insist on accountable science, evidence-based science, and all the facts show that the CO2 theory is nonsense. It involves fraud, and we've now set up an international geoethics committee which is going to go hard against fraud by governments and government scientists.
So all these green taxes, all this deindustrialization in the name of combating global warming, it's your case that these have been all fundamentally flawed.
Yes, absolutely.
And what about the hybrid vehicles? Would it not be the case that if the global warming argument is not true, that they would not have flourished? Or
Things like hybrid vehicles are experimental, fine, do it. But I mean, they're not the answer to anything, because all you're doing, in terms of CO2, you're just making the CO2 in a power station somewhere and making it into electricity. So, you know, it might be less diesel fumes in the city, which is a good thing. But in terms of so-called saving the planet by reducing CO2, it's nonsense unless you turn over to nuclear power. But then, of course, the nuclear power has all sorts of issues if people get hold of waste plutonium, we could have a few problems.
Indeed. So if not global warming, I want you to show the viewers what it is that causes fluctuations, because that's what we are now talking about, not an ever upward curve, but fluctuations in global temperatures. I have brought along a prop that might be useful. I have the whole world in my hands. I told you it was Sputnik orbiting the world.
So what we want to do is show on this, I'll stand up for that, the jet stream. Now the jet stream is upper air, which moves very fast, goes round and round the globe. This is a very simplified version, but the point is, when the globe is warmer, the jet stream is shorter, and the cold bit to the south is, the warm bit to the south is bigger, and the cold bit to the north is smaller. Okay, and in periods of low solar activity, the jet stream gets longer, goes further south, and has more waves in it. Now that's the situation we are in now.
Circle.
No, it's waving around. It's more like the Ganges Delta, but you know, it goes all over the place. But basically, it can be simplified in terms of a stream. So if you have the jet stream, say, going south like this, then this will bring a lot of very cold air from the Arctic and whack through Britain, and that will bring snow down into the Mediterranean. And on this side, especially in the summer, you can have these great streams of air which come from the Sahara up into Russia. So we had that superheated Russia in 2010, for example, August 2010. And the motion of the jet stream is controlled by solar activity, and we can predict changes in the jet stream and extreme weather. Now, the carbon dioxide theory cannot explain anything about the jet stream. They add as much CO2 as they want into their models. It does not affect the jet stream, whereas the solar activity does. So we say that under the Climate Change Act in Britain, Section 6, Clause 2, where it says, as the science changes, then the measures have to change. We say, look, the science has changed. It's not what the Climate Change Act assumed, so there has to be a discussion in Parliament, in Britain and Europe, to revise what they think and actually apply proper science. The logic of which would be get rid of all carbon taxes. That's what we say, but let's discuss it. And therefore save the British steel industry, for example, which has been closed because of high energy charges.
This will be very hard for them to accept because they have moved, the establishment and the political class and the liberal media class has moved so monolithically towards the traditional global warming thesis.
They worked decades on it to get governments all over the world to agree on the...
Okay, but who has worked? You see, if scientists don't agree, they're marginalised, not given jobs in universities and so forth. Now, I've got plenty of friends in academia who just shut up, you know, because to speak out will give them trouble. But I'm a scientist that is supported independently by selling forecasts to farmers, so nobody can touch us financially. So we say what we want.
Now, outside, we've got Storm Desmond. People are getting ready to shiver through another bitter winter. Pensioners not being able to pay to keep themselves warm, choosing between food and heat, and all the norms of contemporary capitalist society. It's always been, I mean, I'm not qualified to really critique your thesis, but it's always seemed rather a tall tale to me that we were causing whatever fluctuations that they were.
Because if you look at the actual amounts, if the whole atmosphere was Big Ben Tower, then the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is just like an inch on the top of Big Ben Tower. And man's contribution to that is a millimetre on top of the inch. So we're asked to believe that man's 1 millimetre controls that 1 inch, which is insane, because of course, if that's true, it means that termites and ants, who produce 10 times as much CO2 equivalent as man, have to follow man's bidding. Well, of course they don't. It's an insane idea. It's an insane idea.
I was going to say this would therefore, if you turn out to be right, and I wouldn't put money against it, would be the greatest hoax. I was going to say the greatest hoax since, but I can't actually think of a hoax that compares with it. What lay behind that hoax?
Well, what is behind this hoax, if you can call it a hoax? Well, it's an unholy alliance of all sorts of people. I mean, people that, young people who want to do good. They're told this is safe in the world, so they join in. Big corporations, they love it because it involves collecting taxes and spending taxes on behalf of big projects like giant wind farms or solar power and so on. Now, those projects on an experimental basis can be good, but to impose them on people, thereby trebling their energy costs, is just completely wrong. It is holding back the development of the third world, not helping it in any way whatsoever.
Now, we've got Storm Desmond outside our door here, but of course we've now descended into another storm, another hot front in Syria. I know you don't speak for your brother, but you do have a voice yourself. How is war around the world affecting the planet? I would have thought a great deal more than a millimetre on top of an inch on top of Big Ben.
Well, no, I think the war around the world, it just causes suffering, and the backlash from bombing plenty of innocent people as well as the people they're looking for is just going to be more jihadis at home, which I think is completely insane. I mean, what you've got to do to stop this war is to cut it off at source. And the funding, look, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Pakistan and Turkey are all funding ISIS.
We're back to money again.
We are.
I'm keeping hold of the world. Piers Corbyn, thanks very much for coming on board the Sputnik.
Thank you very much.
Coming up next, possibly the most prolific writer on God's green earth, Francis Beckett. Stay tuned.
Welcome back to Sputnik. 1956 was a seminal year. Britain's imperial pretensions came to a crushing end. In the Suez affair, the Soviet Union denounced Stalin, invaded Hungary, and the US formally declared itself the unchallengeable leader of what it called the free world. Francis Beckett is the author of Blair Inc., Clem Attlee, and much else besides, and he has chronicled that year in mesmerizing detail in his latest book, which is why we're glad he's back on board the Sputnik. Francis, you know I enjoy your work. I have more of your books than almost any other author. But the first chapter of this book, I almost called you up, but it was too late at night, to tell you was one of the most sustained, ferocious, brilliant and eloquent critiques of what Britain was like in 1956.
Well, thank you, George. I'll come back now. Thank you.
So before we go worldwide, tell the viewers, many of whom in these UKIP days are a bit nostalgic for 1950s Britain, what it was really like.
Well, I don't think I'd advise anybody to go back to 1956. If you were able to take a trip back to 1956, you'd discover a world in which women were supposed to regard sex as a kind of commodity which you traded for a wedding ring. There's a wonderful story about 1956 told by David Lodge. He says that he and his girlfriend, firstly, after 6 or 8 months, he felt her breast outside the bra and so on until about 5 years. It's the longest warm-up session in history. It was also a time when people genuinely still believed that Britain ruled the waves. It was a time when if you or I went into a barber shop, we would say short back and sides, and it would be considered unmanly to say anything else at all. It was the time of, there was a play just before 1956, in 1955, by John Osborne, who became famous in 1956, of course, for Look Back in Anger. But in 1955, there'd been a kind of preliminary to that called Epitaph for George Dillon. And there's a wonderful exchange in that epitaph where somebody says, and it would be perfectly conceivable that somebody might say it in the years before 1956, somebody said, you know, Hitler had the right idea. And the other person on the stage said, really? And he said, yeah, but he went too far. And the other one says, you think he went too far? And the first one said, definitely too far. And that is a dialogue, if you can remember the era, which could have happened.
Well, I was born in 54, so I don't recall 56 very much. But the jukeboxes began to change, of course, in 1956. Prior to that, I don't know, Henry Mancini and his orchestra, the big band sound. Rock and roll was born, in a way, in
British
1956.
rock and roll was born. British rock and roll was born in 1956. Before 1956, insofar as you knew anything at all about rock and roll, it was an American. It was the American version, and it was an American import.
So it was Bill Haley and the Comets. And
and it was regarded as something pretty strange and pretty odd. And it's only 1956 when you get homemade rock and roll, you get Tommy Steele, and you get the people who are making it in Britain, and suddenly it becomes something that the British are really keen on and really interested in.
And the youth began to have purchase, didn't they?
Yeah, they did. The word teenager was pretty new at the time, but what it really meant was that for the very first time, people in their teens had some sort of purchasing power. I mean, one of the many reasons I would advise the young never to try to go back to the 50s, which they're so often advised to do, is that they had no money, no power, they were little people sent around in their school uniforms, and if they wanted something, they had to ask somebody for the penny to go and buy it. It's only at that time that teenagers start to become people with some sort of independent purchasing power and some sort of decision-making power over what the society was going to produce.
And they had attitudes to race, we've touched on, but also to women, which seem like prehistoric now.
Extraordinary. There was a musical of the time called Salad Days. It was very, very popular, very famous musical, and it was very popular and ran for years. And there was a scene towards the end where the young woman had she'd been a little bit difficult. So eventually the boyfriend put her over his knee and spanked her, and she didn't misbehave again.
And I saw the exact scene in this television documentary series. It was all right in the 60s. It was all right in the 60s, and people look back at it with horror today, obviously.
By the 60s in London, perhaps not in Scotland, George,
not in
where
the
you
provinces.
were, but I wasn't going to say...
We were still spanking in the provinces, well into the 60s.
Oh, I wish I'd lived with you. But no, it didn't happen. In London, at any rate, it wouldn't have been all right in the 60s. By the end of the 50s, people were starting to see that sort of behaviour wasn't acceptable. But, of course, we'd watched American films. We'd watched John Wayne, who did it on a regular basis.
Yes, indeed. Now, of course, 1956 and your book deals with the vast, seminal international events, as well as looking at British society. Let's deal with the first of those. Suez, known now as a fiasco, led to the defenestration of the Prime Minister, Anthony Eden, who was already falling by the end of 56, replaced in January 57 by Harold Macmillan. What was the story of Suez, and what was its lasting impact, particularly on the Conservative Party?
Well, the long story is that Suez was part of Britain's absurd pretension that it could somehow or another make the Middle East a better place by continually sending troops in, so that we had absolutely as the British government still seemed to labour under this strange illusion. But the story was that President Nasser of Egypt wanted to take over the Suez Canal. Not, you and I might think necessarily, an unreasonable thing to do, given that it flowed through his country. And he wanted the revenues from the ships that passed through it. And of course, this horrified the British government, and to cut a very long story very short, the British sent troops in. Militarily, it was a fairly successful campaign. They were starting to overwhelm the Egyptian army and retake the canal. But what they had not done was to check it out with the Americans beforehand. President Eisenhower was just up for re-election, and this hit him 2 or 3 days before polling day in his re-election campaign, and his wrath was terrible. And the moment he was re-elected, he gave a curt instruction to the British that if they didn't withdraw immediately, there would be oil sanctions, there would be financial sanctions, there was immediate selling of sterling at an enormous rate, and the British government was forced to realize that if it did not withdraw from Suez immediately, the nation would be bankrupt.
And thus the United States declared itself the boss.
Thus, the United States declared itself the boss, mainly through Eden's stupidity and foolishness. The United States, and from then on in, from then on in, no British Prime Minister has done. If an American president says to a British Prime Minister, jump, the British Prime Minister says, how high? And there have been practically no British Prime Ministers who have bucked that trend. Oddly, the one who began to buck it was Ted Heath to some extent. And
because his vision turned to Britain
rather than to
a European power.
But pretty well every Prime Minister since then has been an Atlanticist. And Harold Macmillan's first job when he became Prime Minister in January 1957 was to crawl off to Washington with as much dignity as he could muster, which wasn't very much, and take whatever crumbs the American president was prepared to throw him by way of a face-saving exercise.
Now, the Soviet Union in 1956 intervened in Hungary with potentially disastrous results
Yes.
for the international movement that was constellating around Moscow at that time. Tell us about that.
Well, Hungary, the Soviet Union intervened in Hungary on the basis that there had been a tremendous revolt against the Hungarian government, which was essentially a Soviet satellite government. It was essentially a government that was, it wasn't totally controlled by the Soviet Union, but it was very largely controlled by the Soviet Union. There was a tremendous reaction against that in the years before 1956, which came to a head in 1956 to the extent that at the same time as the Suez invasion happened, the Soviet Union sent troops into Hungary. Now, I suspect, and the papers tend to bear this out, that it wasn't entirely an accident that it happened at the same time as the Suez adventure, and that if the British government had behaved a little bit more sensibly over Suez, we might never have seen Hungary. What happened, I think, was that Khrushchev saw that the West wasn't really paying attention, was far too bound up with its own affairs to take very much interest in what was going on in Eastern Europe. So he invaded Hungary, he installed a government that was going to be much more amenable to Soviet guidance, and so things remained for many years afterwards.
To what extent, then, can we say 1956 was a major turning point in world events?
I think it was a major turning point in world events and an even more major turning point in British events. It was the time when Britain was forced to realise that it was no longer an imperial power, that it couldn't really do anything on the world stage that the Americans didn't approve of. It was the time that the Soviet Union, it was the first time that the Soviet Union, in order to keep control of the areas of Eastern Europe which it had, in which it had installed governments after the Second World War, it was the time, the first time in which it actually had to be seen to hold one of them down. It was the time, because of that and because of Khrushchev's secret speech, which happened earlier in the year, in which Khrushchev denounced the crimes of Stalin. It was the point at which, in Britain, it was the beginning of the end for the British Communist Party, because the British Communist Party found it harder and harder thereafter to be able to sell the Soviet Union as a model for socialism. So really it was a turning point in world events in every possible way.
It's a fantastic book. I don't agree with everything in it, but I urge everyone to read it.
Thank you, George.
Francis Beckett, thanks for joining us on the Sputnik. And now it's your turn to tell us what you think through the portals of social media. What's rattling, Gayatri?
So I asked, climate change, man-made or not? And Ricardo Picasso makes a very strong counter-argument to Piers's thesis. It may prove to be man's worst contribution to planet Earth, worse than war, imperialism and oppression. We will never change the world if we don't have one in which to live. And Khalid Galayini says, we surely can't change the climate, but we can try to stop human greed.
I must say I'm increasingly interested in Piers Corbyn's thesis. I'm not really qualified to be the judge, but I hate prevailing orthodoxy because it is so very often wrong.
And that's all that we've got time for this week.
Which, alas, means that's the end of the show.
You can stay in touch with us, though, on Twitter at RT_Sputnik or on Facebook, Sputnik on Russia Today. It's goodbye from me, Gayatri.
And from me, George Galloway. It's been marvellous.